So tonight is the first presentation in our new spring webinar series. Tonight, we're really excited to hear from Tess O'Sullivan with the Idaho chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And we hope that you'll be able to join us for future webinars in the coming weeks, featuring Anya Tyson, who's now in Oregon, Catherine Hale, who's working in North Carolina, and Jesse Griffin, who's also working in Oregon with the Oregon chapter of the Nature Conservancy. On the last slide. So our first presenter tonight is Tess O'Sullivan, a 2002 graduate of the Field Naturalist program at UVM and an employee of the Nature Conservancy in Idaho, who will be presenting to us about her work conserving critical connections for Idaho wildlife. Tess is the Land Conservation Strategy Lead for TNC Idaho. A dedicated conservation biologist, Tess has experience in conservation easements, botany, ecology, wildlife migration, range management, mapping, ecological monitoring, and partnerships. She has worked in large landscape conservation in Idaho since she graduated from UVM in 2002. So before we turn it over to Tess, please make sure your microphones are muted. That's in the bottom left of your Zoom screen. If you're having technological issues, you can add a note in the chat. We'll reconvene at about 7:45 for questions, so be taking notes about those questions, and you're welcome to pop them in the chat box if you'd like. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Tess.
Well, thanks so much, Hannah. I moved to Idaho 18 years ago, right after graduation, and I have only been back to Vermont one time, which makes me sad. And I get the alumni emails occasionally asking about the webinar or the symposium, and I think that it would just be a dream to come visit, but it doesn't always seem so. This is a treat, and thank you for joining tonight. And one of the things that I really miss about Vermont is just how green it is. And where I am in Idaho, just to kind of give you a little flavor, today we're having kind of a Idaho rainstorm, which means it's a little cloudy and a little windy, and there's some rumbling, but there hasn't been a single raindrop that's actually landed on the earth. So it's kind of like actually get a raindrop, even though it's a rainy week. I guess I looked it up. Burlington, Vermont has about 37 inches of rain a year, and where I am in Ketchum has about 16, not in the picture here. We're not looking at that. So tonight I wanted to share my work in Idaho with the nature animals that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, both the pronghorn and their migration in south central Idaho, and then up north here where we're looking at this photo in North Idaho, and looking at grizzly bear migration and how we've been working to protect those migration corridors up in North Idaho. And both of those efforts have really been landscape scale, multi-partner projects to connect lands for wildlife across land ownerships. And so I want to start this photo of where I am now in south central Idaho. So I landed, had a little bit of landscape shock when I came here. This blob kind of in the middle lower part of the map is the Craters of the Moon lava flows. And that's at the south end of the landscape that I've spent to protect. And then here in the central area, it are the Pioneer Mountains. And this valley over here is where Sun Valley, the well-known ski resort, is. And then as you go up from the Pioneer Mountains, you enter a network of roadless areas and wilderness areas that are some work of undeveloped land in the lower 48. Okay, and so I wanted to jump in and share some fun facts about pronghorn, an animal that I've really learned to love since coming to Idaho. And so I think of it as this superpower. Superhero, I mean, with superpowers. So the pronghorn superpower is their speed. And they're so fast that pretty much every time I see them, I do not get a photo. And so I have a lot of photos of blurry sagebrush and like, okay, missed it again today. But they are so fast because they evolved alongside dire wolves and saber-toothed tigers before the last ice age. And so they evolved and adapted to see far and run fast. And that is what they can do really well. They can outrun, even though a cheetah is faster in a 50-yard dash, they can get to a max speed of like 60 miles per hour and sustain a speed of like 30 to 40 miles an hour over the long haul. And so they're the marathoners of the West. And some of the adaptations that allow them to do this, or they have incredibly thick leg bones, which allow them to run that fast over rough terrain without breaking any bones. And they share a lot in common with really elite athletes. They have this high level of hemoglobin in their blood. And they're just really, really incredible animals to watch and see, although often the sighting is quite quick. And at this time of year, they are migrating. The landscape here in a lot of the areas that I work looks like this. I work in the sagebrush steppe. So there are a lot of hillsides where they're covered in sagebrush, and they start to turn green and a lot of times golden in the springtime. And the expression that people who think a lot about pronghorn, they say they're riding the green wave of vegetation as things green up and they're able to move to higher elevations. And one of the challenges they face in this landscape, and in a lot of parts of the West, is that no one place can support them for their full life cycle. In the spring, this kind of place is great, but it only lasts so long, and then they need to move to higher elevation when this dries out. And when the fall comes, they need to get out of here fast because the snow is going to come and it's going to completely bury all the vegetation and there's going to be nothing to eat. So they need to head to a different location and take advantage of Idaho's crazy wind. And they find these very wind-swept places where the wind blows the snow off the sagebrush and they can find vegetation to eat. And so I got to know pronghorn when I came west and I started working for Lava Lake Ranch, a ranch that was just getting started and really was interested in being dedicated to conservation and sustainable grazing and ranching. And they were this elusive animal. Like, we didn't really know that much about them. And sometimes you would see them, sometimes you wouldn't. And there was this place right at the entrance to the ranch where there were these white rocks on the top of the hillside. And every time you would go in, I had this routine where I had to check out the white rocks and see if it was pronghorn today. And most of the time it was the white rocks. But we decided to just kind of got more curious of wanting to learn more about the pronghorn. And one of the things that really inspired me was I went to this conference. I went to a Society for Conservation Biology conference, and we've all been to conferences where it's like, I'm not really sure this is worth my time, and gosh, I have a lot of work I should be doing. But this one, I'm so grateful that I went. It was in 2006, and there was a presentation by Joel Berger, who was working at the time for the Wildlife Conservation Society, and he gave a presentation about documenting pronghorn migration routes using GPS technology in Wyoming. And it was really remarkable because they showed exactly where the pronghorn were going and how there were different areas along the route that had been used for millennia. They were able to find bones going back, that much time to show that this has been the route that has been used for so long, and that some kind of development could come along and totally cut off the migration, in which case, you know, the animals that people were seeing in the national parks might not be there if they couldn't get between their winter range and their summer range. So we set out, and actually with another former FN, Mike Stevens, who's now the Washington State Director for the Nature Conservancy, we were working together at the time, and we said, okay, we've got to do this study. And so we set out and did a GPS color study of the pronghorn that were in this Pioneer Mountains summer range. And one of the the trickiest part about, or there were a lot of tricky parts about doing this work. One of them was just getting the funding to get the project off the ground. But then the next key part was this technology at the time was still relatively new. But we had to recover the collars. So the GPS collars show exact locations where the pronghorn are every day, sometimes multiple points a day. But the way it was set up, the collars were programmed to release off the necks of these animals that were unlucky enough to be the ones chosen for the study, and they would fall to the ground. And we programmed them so that it would be back on the summer range. But still, you know, really didn't know how this would go. And I didn't have much experience, or didn't have any experience doing telemetry projects, and had at least one time where I was kind of keeping track of the animals throughout the season, and I was getting lots of signals that I realized later were from a power line. So anyway, it was with big relief that we found the collars and were able to document and show where this migration went. And one of the questions we had at the beginning when we were doing this work, I showed you the picture of the lava at the south end of my landscape that I work. And our question was, how they get past the lava? You know, do they have some secret little path where they can get across where it's more vegetated? Some of these lava flows are as fresh as 3,000 years old, so they're really lava-y and not friendly for walking across, no matter how tough your feet are. And it turned out that they were not going north to south from high elevation to low elevation as we had expected, but it was more of a west-east flow, and it was also much farther than we thought. So up here we have the summer range in the southern Pioneer Mountains, and we have this migration corridor, and we thought maybe they were going as far as this place of Arco, Idaho. But it turned out that they were going 80 to 120 miles one way, all the way to the foot of the Continental Divide. And so now that we had this information, we worked with a lot of partners. The Park Service was a key one, obviously, since the National Monument is this key area along the route where it becomes this bottleneck. And the animals are going in single file, such that for 8 miles, you can see the route from Google Earth because they are leaving a track, and they've been doing it for so long. So now that we had this information, a big question was, you know, what do you do to keep this migration corridor intact? And this is a little bit where I transition my story from having been working for this ranch, and then now the work of the Nature Conservancy that I've been involved with personally since 2015, but it's been going on for over a decade in this area. And so this is a map of, we have the Sun Valley and Ketchum area, the Wood River Valley, which is a developed area and highly desirable. You know, you have kind of high rolling jet setters who are coming to this area, which, you know, depending on the news you might have read, we were in the news because we were the highest per capita COVID cases at one point, because we just have so many people coming from so many different areas, you know, people coming from Seattle and New York and LA and close quarters. So this area to the east, these Southern Pioneer Mountains, really, we have all this private land. And so I can orient a little bit more. You know, the pink is this National Park Service land, the green National Forest, the blue Bureau of Land Management. So we have a lot of public land in Idaho, a lot of land that's already, you know, really managed at some level for conservation, not threatened to massive land use change. We don't have a lot of pressure for mining and oil and gas like they do in some other parts of the West where pronghorn live. So the big key thing here was all this private land that's in the mix. And in 7, just a small amount of that land had been protected. And this land is not just important for pronghorn, you know, really productive habitat, riparian corridors, aspen stands, a lot of working ranch lands. It's an area where there's a lot of historic and still active sheep ranches. And so really keyed in on these private lands as an essential part of putting the puzzle pieces together for conservation. And so we and our partners worked to get a lot of public funding and private funding to protect these lands with conservation easements so that they couldn't be developed and there couldn't be commercial uses that would harm and change the character of the land. And you know, one of the filters we used in planning out our conservation was this pronghorn migration route. So you can see on this map in the green, kind of the bright green, we have land conservation projects that we've completed, land protection, and then we have the migration route. And so we've really focused in on this one aspect of the route. And we've protected over 94,000 acres of land. And so it's been, you know, really quite a big success. But the land protection is only part of the story. And I've had some new coworkers this spring because of COVID. And so I took my new coworkers, my children, out to see the pronghorn coming back to their Idaho, or not their Idaho, I guess they're in their Idaho throughout the year, but coming back home in the spring to the pioneers. And we went out to a property that the Nature Conservancy currently owns and bought in part to help protect this migration route. And we found this really nasty fence out there. And while I said that pronghorn's a superhero with superpowers, they also have their kryptonite. And pronghorn's kryptonite pretty much looks right like this. This is like the worst possible fence you could have. It's got these panels that are meant to keep sheep from getting, you know, through an area, and it's got this barbed wire on the top and the bottom fence. And so a key part of our conservation work has been not just land protection, but land stewardship. And one of the things that really stood out to me is we bought this property. There was initially some work to modify the fencing, and it was kind of understood of like, oh yeah, you know, we took care of that. But what I noticed is that, you know, you can do all this kind of high-tech work and have your satellite map and have your remote sensing and other things, but there really is no substitute for having someone on the ground who knows the land and is paying attention and looking and noticing, okay, where are there barriers to these wildlife migration? What can I do to make a difference in a way that's also not going to hinder managing livestock? And so this has been just a real pet fun project for me, and we've already gotten the hog wire is what it's called, or the that nasty fence out of there, and working to make this just more permeable for wildlife. And so that is often a challenge with the conservation work that we have, is how do you balance things like your land protection with your focus on land stewardship? Often land protection is a one-time significant investment, and the stewardship is something that needs to continue over time. But one of the things we know for sure is that when we focus on one animal that's migrating across such long distances, we're not just benefiting that one animal like the pronghorn. There's a lot of overlap between what different species need. Like sage grouse is a really important wildlife to protect in our area, and there's a lot of concern about, and there's for sure overlap between what those two species benefit from. Okay, so I know I'm probably going to fit a lot in here, but I'm just going to keep rolling. And I want to share a little bit more about our work in North Idaho. And I have, let's see, my coworker is just getting his charger for the Kindle, so I'm distracted for a moment. But so I'm going to switch gears, like I said, and jump up here to North Idaho, where I've also gotten to know another wildlife hero that inspires me as I do my work to protect land in Idaho. So here we are standing at the foothills of the Cabinet Mountains, looking out over the Kootenai River over at the Selkirk, or the Purcell Mountains. And here is a home that the grizzly bear lives in. And the grizzly bear is another superhero, and their superpower is their sense of smell. And apparently, the grizzly bears have 100 times more scent receptors in their nose, or maybe it's like 100 times stronger a scent receptor than, gosh, I might even have to look that up, than humans. And they have 1 billion receptor cells. I made a note about that. And the most powerful sense of any mammal. And the reason that they have this superpower is because they need to eat a lot, and they can only eat for part of the year. So they need to be able to smell their food from a really long way away. And here they are. Here is a map, excuse me, of the recovery zones in North Idaho. So you can see we're up here. British Columbia, Canada is to the north, and there are these different recovery zones where grizzly bears can still be found in the lower 48. There's the Selkirk Recovery Zone and the Cabinet Yaak Recovery Zone, and our work is trying to connect their ability to connect and get across from one of these and back to the other, both into Montana, into Canada, and back to Idaho. And a key thing for grizzly bears is that they need a lot of space. Females need from 50 to 300 square miles, and males need 200 to 500 square miles. And so that's a lot of space, especially for something that is not always welcome, depending on where they spend their time. So in the winter, they need remote areas. In the US, that's high up on national forest lands where they're spending 4 to 6 months in hibernation, giving birth. And then in the spring, like now, they're coming down to wetlands. And again, they're like the pronghorn, they're riding that green wave of fresh vegetation that's coming up, and they are on private lands. And they're in valley bottoms that are in between the forests that they will be on again in the summertime. And so in the summer, they're on a feeding frenzy. And here they are eating huckleberries. They are trying to gain 3.5 pounds a day, mostly eating huckleberries. And huckleberries in North Idaho are just like a way of life. I mean, try asking anyone where their local, that was like one of my dreams when I was spending time up here. Okay, I really want to collect huckleberries. But you can't go to anyone and be like, so tell me where you like to pick huckleberries. They kind of like chuckle and then as quick as they can, change the subject. But the bears don't have any trouble finding them because they can smell it from miles away. And then again in the fall, things dry out. They need to come back down to the valley bottoms. So the, the, the grizzlies, face a big challenge. There used to be 50,000 grizzlies in the lower 48. Now their numbers are down to 1,500. One of the challenges for them is that they are really good mothers. And that means they are slow reproducers. They the females don't give birth until they're about 5, and then they wait and have another young every 2 to 3 years. So a female might only have 10 cubs in her lifetime, and sadly half of them will die before making it to 1 year old. There are other barriers for grizzlies. Obviously, they need a lot of space. They can come into conflict with humans. Gene flow is an issue. If they cannot be getting across from these different recovery zones, they're going to become, and they have started to become genetically isolated, and then they don't have a healthy genetic population to maintain themselves. Another barrier is development. In this area, there's a lot of, this is North Idaho. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the area, but we're roughly in between Sandpoint and the Canadian border. So this is a popular place for people to move. It has been, a sleepy small town Idaho, but it has a lot going for it. It's beautiful. It's relatively affordable, tons of great recreation. And so people who are really fleeing the more crowded, hassled kind of lifestyle, especially people who are kind of ready to retire and they can take their money from their property in California and, get a great place here. There's a lot of change and it's happening really fast. And the politics are very conservative, so there's not a lot of zoning or anything to help kind of stem the tide. And so a key thing for us is like, okay, how can we connect these forest lands and maintain corridors where these animals, and not just the grizzlies, can get across from forest land to forest land. One of the places where grizzlies can get in trouble is they really rely on the orchards in the area for fattening up in the fall. There are a lot of orchards, but then if they're coming into orchards, they're really close to people's houses. Okay, and so our vision is to, like I said, connect these valley bottoms. And one of the challenges that we face is we've had a lot of success in this area as well, securing federal funding for conservation. One of the challenges is that the funding source that we have is coming through the Forest Legacy Program, and the funding is coming through the Forest Service. And so the Forest Service, the program is set up to protect forest lands. And so we see this real need to connect the valley bottoms, which is often ag land. But the funding source is really set up, there's a requirement that there has to be so much forest land on the property. And so kind of trying to fit in our conservation goals into the funding sources that are available is a challenge. And one of the things that we face in Idaho is that we have no state funding for conservation like a lot of other places do. So we are relying a lot on federal funding and then private funding. But we have worked with a lot of great landowners who are eager to protect their lands. And that's a lot of fun. That's a really fun part of the job, is to get to know people. It can be very interesting when, you're having these conversations with people at their kitchen table, someone you've never met before, and you're really talking about kind of pretty big questions of what kind of legacy do you want to leave behind after you die. And so framing those conversations in a sensitive way can be a challenge, but a lot of people are, eager to have, it just really depends on the personalities of how those conversations go. And again, in this Kootenai Valley area, we and our partners have really accomplished a huge amount of private land conservation. Here was our map with, in pink, private lands that have been protected. And then here we are in 2020. We've really filled in the map. And just to highlight, like the pronghorn migration, we have scientific telemetry data showing where the grizzly bears migrate. And so these 4 areas are 4 migration corridors that have been identified. They're lovingly referred to as chopsticks. And so we have focused our land protection effort within inside these chopsticks. And, have been filling in the map to the tune of 100,000 acres with other partners. And I think it's $71 million have been invested in this. And again, with the grizzlies, we're not focused on a single species. There are many animals that need these wetlands, need the private lands to connect to the forest lands. And so we keep that in mind as we do the work. And let's see. And so one thing that's fun for me as I do this work is I often think about the legacy of what we're doing. And I a lot of times we focus on the legacy of the private landowners, the legacy of our donors, but I also think about the legacy of our work as conservationists. And I will say that it's easy to, read the news or think about the challenges that we face in conservation and to feel overwhelmed by it. And something that helps me is knowing that I am working hard and making a difference for these special places, but also knowing that my work can be added to the work of my colleagues at the Nature Conservancy. And, I love just being a part of this all the different states and across the globe, the effort that's happening, but also the work of this network of the field naturalists and ecological planners. And I really do owe a debt of gratitude to the program, and I am so grateful that I'm a graduate of UVM, and very grateful to Dean and Jeffrey. And I really use my training on a daily basis. One moment I'm out looking at plants, and the next minute I'm making a GIS map, and then here I am trying to think of what story I'm going to start my next presentation with. So I wanted to share that, and I know I covered a lot, and I'm happy to answer questions or go back and talk about more of this. So yeah, with that, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions, and happy to discuss.